Hello everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Google Pixel 4 and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now with something like the Pixel 4, what I will definitely tell you is these are very interesting phones because they kind of signified Google's kind of pause in some of their core philosophies, in which I think what is kind of making them successful nowadays. So if you want to pick up some Google Pixels that I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get those phones from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now with something like the Google Pixel 4, this phone did come out back in 2019, and this phone was, like I said, a different approach than what Google was kind of doing before. These phones weren't cheap, they were a little bit more expensive, and they still looked good. But I think 2019, those phones looked so good that year, and they just blew these Pixels out of the water. Pretty much came late 2019. So with the Pixel 4 on the front, we had a 5.7-inch POLED display. It was a 90Hz panel, and it was 1080p. And to be honest, it's actually like not a bad panel. It's a pretty decent panel for what this phone was. It was the first time that we saw a screen refresh rate increase in the whole entire Pixel lineup, as far as I know. We had a little bit of bezel at the very top. We had a little bit of bezel surrounding this whole entire phone too. And I definitely do think this was a smart thing that Google did. By making a phone that looks even remotely close to this, it was a very good approach. Unfortunately for Google, there were just so many good phones that came out in 2019, including the Samsung Galaxy S10, the OnePlus 7 Pro came out this year, the Samsung Galaxy Note 10 and Note 10 Plus came out this year, the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max came out this year too, and all those phones pretty much came out before this one did. So by this time, I mean, we kind of were like expecting probably something better. If not, then we were just going to go pick up a used Galaxy S10 as of that moment. And that is exactly, I think, what a lot of people ended up doing. Now on the bottom of this phone, we had our USB Type-C port, which was great. And on the back, we had this glass, back on some models. My specific model didn't really feel completely like a glass back. It was that orange one I originally had. This new one that I have kind of pretty much falls in line with it, so it pretty much feels like that. But that was another cool thing that kind of ended up happening too, that they ended up bringing a full-on glass back. And I will give Google credit. They made this phone definitely look better than the previous several generations. I think since the Pixel 2 XL, these phones definitely looked better. But as I mentioned, I mean, there were some other things that kind of threw a lot of people off. But also, I would have loved to have seen Google kind of maybe take a little bit of a different approach in the design. Like I said, this time that year, we already had so many phones that had a hole punch display and even removed the hole punch display like the OnePlus 7 Pro. So this phone wasn't really doing anything different that we didn't already see, to be honest. Now this phone also has IP certification and wireless charging, so it still looks like a pretty good phone now, but it was very interesting when this phone first came out in 2019. Now we do have to talk about the cameras, and I think this was another area where Google just completely dropped the ball. So I remember in the keynote when Google was making their announcements of these phones, they basically said that, hey, these cameras have a telephoto lens because we don't really care too much about an ultra-wide camera. They said something along the lines of that, and a lot of people were upset at Google about that. And that's completely true. I actually prefer an ultra-wide sensor over a telephoto lens, and I actually think a lot of people actually feel the same way. So this phone had a dual camera setup on the back, a 12.2 megapixel wide angle lens, and then a 16 megapixel telephoto lens, and on the front it had an 8 megapixel wide angle lens. Now I will definitely tell you, from when it comes down to it, this camera, first of all, not a bad camera. It's definitely a decent camera. Google cameras are just notorious of not having too many features though, so these phones are very bare bones. Even the Pixels nowadays still are very basic cameras for the most part, which is expected because they're stock Android and they don't want to just put crazy miscellaneous features. That's kind of more Samsung's approach. But I will definitely say I would prefer Samsung camera over this type of camera. I like how the minimalistic this camera is, but it is really nice to have a lot of features. And unfortunately, these phones don't really have too many features built in. On top of that, the Google Pixel lineup was built on having like an amazing camera, and although this phone's camera wasn't horrible, it definitely wasn't better than any other phone camera that came out that year, including the iPhone 11, in my opinion. The OnePlus 7 Pro's camera was probably worse than this thing, but it looked better because it just looked like a way better phone. And also the Samsung Galaxy S10 and Note 10 had substantially better cameras than this phone in my opinion. And you could film in 4K at 60 on the front and back of both those phones, where you couldn't even do 4K well, you can even do 4K at 60 on the back of this phone, only 4K at 30. So definitely that was a pretty big L in my opinion for Google. I feel like they should have done a better job there. Again, there's not much we can do now. We just kind of have to sit here and complain. But that was a really weird thing that Google ended up doing here. It seems like they were relying too much on the software side of the camera rather than actually improving the hardware there. So that was kind of one thing to keep in mind. I think the Google Pixel 4 camera is fine, but it definitely wasn't better than the majority of the cameras that came out in 2019. So moving on to the software and the longevity of this phone. This phone is pretty much discontinued in terms of software. I mean, I think it might be getting like another version of software, maybe if we're lucky, but I wouldn't really count on that. And I'm pretty sure that this phone is pretty much done. It lasted a long time though. You know, I will give Google a lot of credit for these types of phones. They just last so long. And that's the thing I love. When you're getting a phone like the Google Pixel 4 or the Pixel 7 nowadays, you are going to be getting a phone that's going to be lasting a long period of time. So personally, that is something I really do like. So, I mean, I guess another thing you can kind of throw in here too is that these phones are going to be probably still getting some sort of, custom ROM and, that kind of direction going on for these phones too. So that's kind of another cool thing that you have going for it. Like, if it still is a situation where this phone is like discontinued or something, I think you're going to be fine. Like, it's not going to be that big of a deal. I wouldn't be surprised if a majority of people are no longer using this phone either. But I will say it is kind of nice having a phone that still has some sort of a community behind it too. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there as well. And moving on to the performance side, I mean, this phone had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset, which was the flagship chipset of that year, and it had 6 gigabytes of RAM. Now, I will tell you, the chipset, perfectly fine. I have no complaints about that. Of course, it's not that good anymore, to be honest, but it was, a really good chipset when it first came out, and that was something I really did like about this specific phone. Unfortunately, I guess the biggest complaints I would have now is that, first of all, the chipset is kind of outdated a little bit, not a big deal, but, 6 gigabytes of RAM, even at that moment, a majority of phones already had 8, like the Note 10 Plus or like the Note 10 or whatever, not a big deal either. And I guess my biggest complaint here was that there were only 2 models, the 64 gig base model and the 128 gig top tier model. I don't know why Google only made a top tier at 128 with no expandable storage. That was the same thing I complained about some other phones that year as well, and I feel like Google could have done a little bit of a better job there. But the performance is still pretty good. It's a very smooth phone, mostly because it's, stock Android, so there's not like a lot of moving pieces in the background, and that is something I actually do like a lot about this phone. It's very minimalistic, and from all the things I could complain about this phone, I can't really complain too much about the performance. It wasn't the best performing phone of 2019. I would probably give that to the iPhone 11 in my opinion, but it's still a very good performing phone for how old it is, and I think it's definitely decent in that perspective. The 855 chipset still is actually holding up decently well, so it's kind of one thing to keep in mind. But beyond that kind of covers it up in the performance segment. The battery life is probably another weird aspect. It had a wireless charging, which is nice, but a 2800 mAh battery really isn't that big, and that was kind of another disappointing area for this phone as well. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I would tell you is that I think the Google Pixel 4 is probably not worth buying anymore. I think this phone was great when it first came out. I think this phone was good when it first came out. It definitely wasn't great, but I think since then it's gotten a little bit better. But the other phones from 2019, I think have held up way better than this phone. Like, I think the Galaxy S10 is one of the best phones ever made, and that phone came out this year. And if you want to go for the iPhone route, the iPhone 11 is also a really good phone that's still supported with software. So it just doesn't really make a lot of sense to go and buy this phone when the other phones surrounding this device were so much better. And don't even get me started about the 2020 phones from Google. The Pixel 5 and the Pixel 4a were very good phones, and I was really happy when Google started making those devices. So, there's really not a big reason to pick these phones up. If you have them or if you want to get them, great, but there's probably definitely better options out there, even from the Pixel lineup, that you can get for probably a little bit more money than this thing. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.